Hello everyone, welcome. Today we're going to talk about economic development and the history of economic development, how it happened, a look back at what happened in Brazil's economic development. The period of economic development is divided into the pre-colonial period before 1500 and the Brazil colony period, which was a time of many transformations that began in France with the French Revolution in 1789. So, from 1500 to 1822, we were affected by this change in the achievements of political, social, and civil rights over in France, which reflected here in Brazil in 1822, when Brazil separated from Portugal. And we started to have a democracy in some way. Black people couldn't vote, women couldn't vote, but it was a democracy nonetheless. And the people started to elect their representatives. So from 1889 until today, we have the Republic. Now we're going to see what the role of the state is. We have three parts where the state has a predominant role. The first one is to ensure political participation, popular involvement in public management matters. This means that the citizen is an integral part of this context. The citizen is the biggest shareholder of a nation, so it's important for them to be engaged in what matters to them in terms of public administration. The participation in political decisions. Here we need to familiarize ourselves with political development, with political knowledge, so we can speak on equal terms with politicians and not let ourselves be fooled. Then we have the rights of citizens that are guaranteed by the 1988 Constitution, which states that people should pay attention to the statutes for both children and adolescents as well as the elderly. Well, we entered a phase in Brazil where, in 1992, the environmental conference took place, where several transformations were shown, presented, and experts decided on various changes that were recorded. And we have the need for a new model of economic development. They came to this conclusion. It was the first conclusion they reached. It was necessary to have a new model of economic development, and that this model of economic development would bring sustainable constructions, including sustainable societies for Brazil. During this period, in 1992, Brazil was facing major financial difficulties, rampant inflation. The people didn't have a consumer education. They struggled, spending more than they could. And in this way, with all this spending, the velocity of money increased, along with the total amount of goods produced and services provided. So, with all that spending people were doing, it multiplied inflation. Because inflation, in reality, is the continuous and widespread increase in prices. So, spending a lot, what did we see? You didn't see it. You saw a developmental practice that ended up failing, because in a way, it increased the GDP. But it was disorganized spending. We didn't have growth in the country. So the population was still reluctant to this education for purchasing. And the government forced, through the SEBIC rate, indices and fees in order to curb a bit this excessive and reckless consumption that was happening. So, at the end of 92, there was the fall and impeachment of Fernando Collor de Mello. Starting in 1993, several changes happened. That brought certain benefits to the country. One of them was the curbing, as I had mentioned, of this excessive consumption through the SELIC rate. It was a rate that, in a way, made the population spend less, and then they sought to grow their savings, investments. That's how Brazil started to get back on track. And starting in 1994, the real plan was implemented, where the currency began to have a value that was quite in line with the value of the dollar. For example, 1 real was equivalent to $1. From there, we entered a phase of growth in Brazil. Let's talk now about the aspect of economic development. At that 1992 conference, ideas about the new model of economic development emerged, and from then on, in the 1990s, the definition of two models of economic development came about. One of them was building citizenship, and the other one was economic development for citizenship. So one of them was related to population growth, and the state was the one that determined and dictated the rules. And the other was development. That was subordinated to economic logic. In other words, capitalists came in, neoliberalism prevailed, and that brought together, in a way, two sides of the same coin. One side was more left-leaning, where the state determined what to do in terms of development with the population and in combating social exclusion. And on the other side, economic development came in through the capitalists, which led to Brazil's growth through economic development. And what would follow would be in favor of the poor. One side was more left-leaning, where the state determined what to do in terms of development with the population and in combating social exclusion. And economic development entered via the capitalists, which led to Brazil's growth through economic development, and what would follow would be in favor of the poor. It was necessary for the subject of economic logic to lead. It was first about having economic development before helping the poor. So both models had, in a way, common objectives. So it was necessary first for the subject of economic logic to prevail. It was about having economic development before helping the poor. So both models had, in a way, common objectives, as you will see. They were related to more or less extremist parties, and one more or less extremist showed that they had common objectives. So far we've talked about that. What was a common objective was that both models of development considered the need for massive investment in education. That was the important part in the personal context. And now you see what was happening with the centrist parties. The middle, center, left and right parties were somewhat squeezed or flattened and lost the doctrine that gave them legitimacy. In other words, it was a soup of letters. They didn't have a well-defined ideology. So it was a combination of less extremist parties, more central, more centralized in the sociology part. So now, all of this combined brought integrated and sustainable local development to a region. This integrated and sustainable local development of a region considered the condition of self-managed societies. What does that mean? That city could and had the ability to sustain itself. The federal government only played the role of supporting those measures. So in this context, several consensuses for integrated and sustainable local development were defined. We're going to look at the consensuses that were defined here. Meeting the most immediate needs was the most important of them. I mean, an immediate need had to be solved overnight, and the city had the ability with its own resources to solve that problem. Awakening local vocations, which is also very interesting, was related to thinking globally and acting locally. The government only took on the role of support. The development was localized. The participation of the community of NGOs was present, folks. We had the councils with their definitions. We also brought in unions, all in favor of a work for the city's growth. A new economic dimension, local capacity for development, right. The exchange relationship with the regions and the indicators of economic development. The partnership between the market, the state, and civil society is also very important. So you see, these consensuses showed us the importance of a region or even a district. We can say District 2 because managing a district is actually better. But in this aspect of the population, we observed that within a city we have a very high rate of social exclusion. Most of the excluded people were concentrated in the Northeast region. So we lived through a period from 1998 to the year 2000, when we had the estimated number of miserable people at a total of 25 million in Brazil. Let's record the estimated number of miserable people at a total of 25 million in Brazil. What event? And it happened that after these first two governments, there was an improvement, but it wasn't significant. The number of miserable people went down from 25 million to 16 million. In a way, the poor, dispossessed, and miserable people in Brazil still made up about 60%. We'll wrap up this topic here. Now let's see what the topic of the next class will be. But before that, I'd like to take a look back with you. What did we see today? We saw through the ECO 92 Environment Conference in Brazil a condition for a new model of economic development. We went through a period of rampant inflation, and we showed that the government was forced to control the excessive spending of a population that wasn't educated for purchasing. Then we had measures regarding the emergence of savings as a control agent, and the government implemented a rate to curb excessive public spending and the spending of the population. So in 1994, we had the real plan, which came and brought good wins for our population, so that the population was more settled, more controlled. And from then on, this currency parity led Brazil through a process of growth. That's what we mentioned, folks. We talked about a lot of things, didn't we? And now we have the topic for the next class, a pre-election campaign strategy. I would like to thank you all for the attention you've given us. And if you have any questions, we also have the handouts for clarification. And we would like you to walk with us. Let's go to the next class. Thank you very much.